All right, Practical Hypermedia Controls by Daniel Little Dev. Okay. Practical Hypermedia Controls. A lot has been written about REST, but less so when it comes to hypermedia controls. I haven't seen too many hypermedia based APIs out in the wild. Okay, so from what I know, before we get into this, from what I know, hypermedia controls are like I'm thinking of like HTMX. I'm thinking of like tags that get added into the HTML to make HTML more usable by itself without a framework and extending the spec. That's what I think about when I think about hypermedia and the hypermedia approach. I have not read the Hypermedia Systems book. It's on my reading list. So, but that's my context for going into this. So I think this is going to be applying that to REST APIs somehow. Maybe it's like interlinking the REST requests, so like having URLs between the different types of resources and all that. Maybe that's where we're going. So let's see. I theorize that there are two main reasons for this. First, it's something many people haven't been exposed to, and second, it requires a little more upfront effort in order to get all the ball rolling. However, I believe it's an incredibly useful pattern, and it's easier to get started than you might think. This post aims to help out with that first problem, exposure. We'll take a look at what hypermedia controls are and why they're useful. Whatever the reason for the rarity of hypermedia controls, what you might commonly see in a REST API instead is something like this. So this is a standard user record, ID, username, name, email, all that. Okay, so this all makes sense. Okay, this JSON object represents a user account. In this system, there are a few simple rules. Only owner of the resource can update it, and only admins can deactivate or activate accounts. This resource uses Boolean flags to inform the client what state the object is in and what actions it can perform. However, there are some problems with this model. We can't tell if the current user should be able to activate or deactivate the account. Yeah, you can't. You basically, yeah, there's nothing that says the permissions. Okay. Before we go any further, what other issues are there with REST? Like a standard REST request. Can deactivate, can update. Okay, I don't know if I get this. Should be able to activate or deactivate the account. I don't know if I get that necessarily. So I guess let's read on. We can't tell if the account can be activated. We have to assume it can be because we can't deactivate it. We don't know how to update or deactivate an account. We need more external information like the URL. Okay, this is what I was saying. So this just talks about the record state. Wouldn't it be nice if all these things were a little bit easier to figure out? I think so too. It would be nice. Would be nice. Okay. Enter hypermedia controls. Hypermedia controls in REST APIs are all about adding links and actions to a resource instead of needing to interoperate what links and actions are available based on state. Okay. Examples of this state are Boolean flags like the above, or status value like ready or pending. Here's what the same resource would look like if we added a hypermedia control instead. So we've got the same ID, username, name, email. Okay. Then we had links, which I assume is like your link to your child records, your parent account, and all that fun stuff. And then actions. Action is update. We get the URL and the method. And activate. You get the URL and the method. Okay. So this is similar to the HTML hypermedia system sort of stuff. This is interesting. So you're providing in a dynamic way what actions can be performed, and then the client can use these to render out different things. I kind of like that. At least from a consumer perspective, that's awesome. Now we can clearly see which actions are available. There are two available actions, update and activate, along with URL and verb needed to make the calls. Instead of the client needing to infer this from the data, the server directly dictates what actions are available. We don't need to assume the client can activate the account if can activate is false. Oh. There's also no danger of adding conflicting flags. The client can directly show or enable buttons or links directly based on what hypermedia controls are present. Okay. So this would be really good if you're using something like you're in a mobile framework, for example, or like have a desktop app and you need to have an API backing that. This sort of format can be really good. And I guess even if you needed to do things with a spot, like HTMX isn't for everything. Even Carson Gross says this too. Like you can't use HTMX in the rich client application setting. It just doesn't make sense to build a Google Docs in HTMX. But you can apparently use the hypermedia style approach even if you're using a client-side framework, client-side rendering. I could see situations where this would make much more sense. Like you'd have to keep so much less state on the client to do this. Like this is, and you're just checking. You even maybe even looping through this and like having a dictionary of like what icon to put on the record. This is pretty neat. This is a lot less things to keep track of on the client and to have to keep in like a Redux or a Pania or Vuex or whatever. Pretty cool. All this makes the API much easier to reason about and use, but the key benefit to the client is no longer it needs to interpret any state to figure out what's going on. We're able to keep the knowledge of who can do what and when on the server without having to duplicate any logic into the client. And while this example is a fairly trivial one, a few more flags like the ones above or worse enum states when the client has to decide what buttons are available based on things like pending, in progress, completed can easily increase complexity and the burden of keeping everything in sync. This is what I've done. I've had like something in global state essentially that indicates pending, in progress, completed, or errored. I'll have like an enum value and then maybe like an error string attached to it next to it. So this is much nicer. I think you still might need some state. I think you still in a client side application you're in those loading states and you've got to figure out how to report that to your user some way. So if you're using a client side app, you need to have that still. So it doesn't fix everything, but it definitely makes certain things maybe a little easier. More control. We can also do more than just make links and actions available or unavailable. We can also show that an action exists but isn't available. On the UI, this could manifest as a visible but disabled button. Oh, I was just thinking about this. I was just wondering like, and I just said it. You just have to like check like a dictionary and then do that. But you'll still need a dictionary, I guess, for your icon state. But you can just check if it's null and then or have a disabled true. That's pretty easy. If you'd like things to be a little bit more dynamic or server controlled, you can also include a title for an action, which could be used as the label for a link or button, or you can include the icon type, pushing more of this to the server side. It's really up to you to choose how much information is provided to the client. However, I'd be cautious of adding too much. You might be tempted to include other metadata like field types or validation rules, but the main goal here is to keep the duplicate logic out of the client and keep the server in control of application state. Decoupling too much tends to lead to inter-platform effect. Okay, we're gonna have to read that here in a second. So client-side routing. Actually, let's look at that now. Let's go look at this. Inter-platform effect is the tendency of software architects to create a system so customizable as to become a replica, and often a poor replica, of the software development platform they're using. This is generally inefficient and considered to be an example of an anti-pattern. Okay. I've unironically done this at work probably a couple times now, and I guess I need to stop. I had this system essentially where I would take a message in and transform it on the way out. So you'd have a message going in and a message going out. And essentially I made it to where there was a configuration file that was part of the service, And as the message came in, the configuration file would drive how to configure an engine. And this engine service inside this microservice essentially would go read the config, and then it would do all the operations outlined in the config, like map this field to here, or block the request if this condition is met, or if this condition is met with this and this, then set like this variable to be this. Or there was even like a map structure, so where like if you get this value, map it to this value. And it was all in JSON, and it was great, and it was awesome, and it worked great. And then I had to come back to it after like 6 months. And all of a sudden I realized I had created an entire DSL specifically in JSON to completely do exactly what a programming language would do and manipulate these records as they came in and out. If I had just written a class or a service inside this service that transforms that data, it probably could even have been part of the producer. It probably should have been part of the producer. But instead, I created this DSL, and it lives on to this day. Like, I have to maintain that to this day. And honestly, it works okay, but I put way too much work into creating that specific DSL that is worse actively than the thing that I was using, which is C#. I could have just written plain C# to define the business logic, and it would have been way more readable, way more efficient, way faster. Everything would have been better. So yeah, okay. The inner platform effect. Cool. Okay, client-side routing. There's one unexpected question I came across while implementing a Hypermedia-based API, which is how they affect client-side routing. I found keeping API URLs in sync with the browser URLs to be a good approach. Or more accurate, I believe they should be the same URL. If you're coming from a non-Hypermedia-based API, your URLs will most likely have diverged. So I'll demonstrate what this looks like in practice. The root Hypermedia resource is the starting point for the API, and it provides all top-level links to get you started. Okay, so you get the base, and then you get the response is links, and then you say my account, and then okay. So it gives you the URLs for the different things. Following a link such as my account, which the client knows by name, would update the browser's route to match, e.g. account 001. The client-side routing rules mirror the server-side rules to render the relevant components, but simply forwarding the URL to the API to fetch a resource. Note that the value here is that the client doesn't have to hard code, reconstruct, or build any URLs. Oh, and say you have, before we get any further, say you have like a list of things, and you're requesting those things from the server, and you have that route on the client. If you take the same URL you're using on the client and you use that same URL to request the server, and you keep those two things in sync, all of a sudden your filters, which will come after your query string that you provide to your client and your server, are the same. The duplication of logic doesn't occur because you're sending the same parameters to the client. So all your paging data, all of your filters that you have on your like table of records that you'd have, that all gets passed to the server and then rendered there and filtered there. You can probably just write like a generic loader function that takes that URL and just hits it on the API side. That's really interesting. I kind of like that idea. It breaks down. If your API is part of like, say like you've got a bunch of microservices behind your application, it breaks down because you're going to have a gateway, and the URL on the gateway, or like the service hub or whatever you use to route your traffic on the incoming side of things, all of a sudden those URLs become much deeper. And so your application, if you got multiple applications using the same gateway, you can get into weird states. So I'm not 100% sold on this idea, but for simple applications, this can be kind of awesome. I like it. It really cuts down on some of the complexity and some of the stuff you have to do client side. So following the link, such as my account, would update the browser's route to match. Yeah. The client side routing rules mirror the server side rules to render the relevant components, but simply forward the URL directly to the API to fetch a resource. Note the value here is that the client doesn't have to hard code, reconstruct, or build any URLs. That's a lot of code that has to be built on the client to do that. Actions are a little bit different and usually represent a route change. I recommend using a get, post, redirect style pattern so that a link or a redirect is used to determine the next URL for the client. Little different and don't usually represent a route change. Well, sometimes they do though. Using a get, post, redirect style pattern. So the link or redirect is used next time to determine the next URL for the client. Yeah, so when you make a change, have the API send the next URL the client should go to the client application. I'm on that side. I think that's a good idea. I think that's a good thing. Next time you're building a form with a few actions, especially if those actions change under different conditions or states, consider using Hypermedia controls. I hope you've enjoyed this article, and if so, make sure to keep an eye out for my next post on type-safe Hypermedia with TypeScript. Okay, that'll be on the list for later. We'll look at that. But written by Daniel Little. This is awesome. If you guys are watching, take some time to go subscribe to his RSS feed. I think this is pretty good. I really like this. I like this. I like this idea overall of, even if you're using a client-side rendering framework, take the hypermedia approach as well anyway. And I like that idea because it lets you incrementally adopt some of this stuff. And so you don't necessarily have to rewrite your application in HTMX. Not that you can't do HTMX bit by bit and load it in, piece by piece. But if you still have a highly interactive app, something like this could be really nice. All that said, most applications can just use HTMX, in my opinion. I don't think there's any real value in doing this if your application isn't highly interactive. If you're just loading forms and stuff, there's no reason to do this. Just use HTMX and then just render everything on the server and then send the bits back to the client that need to change. I think your life will end up being much, much simpler in the end. But I think this is, I like this. I like this idea. This gives you more options, essentially. I'm a fan. So if you like this article, if you like my commentary on it, please leave a like or a comment. If you hate it, let me know in the comments section. We record these every week on Mondays at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time over on Twitch. So if you'd like to join us, the link is in the description. All right, everybody have a good one.